So, hello everyone. Thank you for those of you who have just joined. There's a small group of us today live in this particular webinar, but we know that there'll be lots of you watching this later on your own time on replay. So if you are watching live, say hello, and if you are joining us on a replay, then thank you for listening. We really hope you find this helpful. Thank you for joining us. In case you don't know me, I'm Katie Friedman, and I am the founder of Flexible Working People. And I set up this business 8 years ago to help to support people going through professional career moves and to find flexible working opportunities. And we have a number of partners, and one of our partners is Winkworth Sherwood. And welcome today to Louise and Sue, who are both from the employment team at Winkworth Sherwood. So thank you both so much for joining us.
Not at all. Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
so
pleased to be here.
It's great to have you. And what we try and do with these sessions, and the reason why we partner with Winkworth Sherwood, is because we always have a lot of questions around legal rights and how they pertain to flexible working, both for individuals and for employers. And so we've chosen a topic today around carers leave, which we're going to unpack for you. There was a new statutory right that came into effect in April of this year. And what we're going to discuss today is what it sort of really means in practice, both for employees and for employers, how it works, how it fits alongside flexible working, and how organisations can really start to think about building genuine carer-friendly cultures. Because often these things go beyond policy and into how you behave as an employer and how you look after your people. So as I said, I'm delighted to be joined by Sue Kelly and Louise. They're both partners at Winkworth Sherwood. They've both got huge expertise in this area, so we're going to hear from them, not really from me. Sue is known for her very pragmatic approach and empathetic advice on flexible working, and Louise is a long-time advocate for family-friendly rights and workplace inclusion. And we've done lots of webinars with Louise before, and Sue, welcome. We haven't done one with you before yet, but we're delighted to have you. So we're hoping this will be a useful and practical session for both if you're tuning in because you want to know more about carers' rights because you are a carer, or because maybe you're a business and you are thinking about what more you could be doing. We hope that you find something useful and valuable that comes out of this. So I'm going to start with Sue. Maybe we could set the scene, Sue, and just talk about why carers leave is sort of such a timely issue now.
Yeah, well, I think, Katie, that the fact is that more and more of us are likely to be carers at some point in our lives. We're all familiar with the caring role of parents, which many of us, but obviously not all of us, undertake. But carers leave is particularly focused on, I would say, the other end of the spectrum, which is caring for elderly dependents, be they parents or spouses, would be the most common examples, I expect. And there are, in fact, 3 million carers who are in paid employment at the moment. There's another 2.7 million who are not in paid employment, but actually combining work with caring is perhaps more common than we might expect it to be. And that is going to become more and more of a thing with the ageing population that we're all aware of. And the workforce is going to be getting older, so it's much more likely that you will be employing somebody who has an old elderly father or mother who needs looking after. And in fact, another statistic for you from Carers UK is that 600 people each day are leaving the workplace to go off and care full time or whatever. They can't seem to manage both. So obviously that is quite a loss to the workforce. Yeah. So if employers don't do something to make their workplaces a bit more carer friendly, that's going to be a significant issue as time goes on.
So those stats are really quite worrying. It's the first time I've heard them. They're quite powerful, aren't they? 600 people each day leaving because of caring responsibilities, and 3 million. So Louise, do you think that employees actually realise how likely it is that they're going to become carers during their working lives? Or do you think this is something that sort of just crops up and they sort of don't really anticipate it? What's your sense?
I'm not sure if employees really do, because I think you're kind of in a bubble of where you are at in your stage of your life, whether that's kind of starting out in your career, potentially thinking about career progression, or potentially having a family. So I think perhaps it's not something employees think about, particularly in the early stages of their career. But as Sue has highlighted, obviously this is going to become an increasing issue for employees in the workplace with the ageing population. We've also got parents having children as they get older. So this is all going to have an impact. And some recent research from Aon, which is called The Ageing Population, Why It's Time to Take Notice, highlighted that 1 in 6 employees will be caring for an elderly relative by 2040. So that really does highlight how significant this is going to be for employees in the workplace. But I'm not sure if people really kind of realise it when they're starting off in their career.
It's interesting, actually, that not that many people have joined this webinar, which may be the answer to your question. People don't really think it's something for them, perhaps, until they hit it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that, as you say, Sue, until you are in that situation, you don't anticipate it. And I think that it's one of those where you don't realise, and then suddenly you're in it and you're like stumbling around looking for that support.
Yeah.
And, suddenly you become an expert in something that you never thought you'd be an expert in. It's one of
Yeah.
those. And so let's shed some light on sort of what carers leave is. Like, let's just talk about the legislation side of things just for a moment. Let's just explore what it is and why it was introduced. I think that's just been a helpful start point for sort of where we are now. Louise, do you want to cover that one?
Sure. So just, I suppose, firstly taking why it was introduced. So it was introduced by Liberal Democrat MP Wendy Chamberlain via private members bill in 2022. And this was following a number of years of the Conservative government looking at this issue. And they undertook consultation. And the consultation responses, they had clear support from that consultation for introducing carers leave. And the purpose of the leave, this new right, which was introduced last year, is to kind of recognise, well, it's seeking to recognise the challenges that employees face in the workplace and give them some flexibility in taking leave for planned care arrangements. So where there's kind of scheduled non-emergency care. So perhaps, for instance, you're attending a medical appointment with someone who relies on you for support. And in terms of the law itself, so the new law applies to all employees, so you don't have to have a particular length of service. It's a day one right. And it's a right to take up to 1 week of unpaid leave. And that doesn't have to be taken in one block. It can be broken up and be taken in half days or single days, up to the maximum of 1 week in a 12-month period. And the leave is to provide or arrange care for a dependent with a long-term care need. So just breaking that down. So a dependent is defined as someone who is essentially kind of an immediate family member, so spouse, civil partner, child or parent, or someone who lives in your household but isn't a kind of tenant or lodger, or someone who reasonably relies on you to provide or arrange care. So that's quite helpful, that kind of sweep up provision, that it extends to not just perhaps immediate family members, but other individuals who reasonably rely on you to provide or arrange care. And the second part of the test is that kind of dependent has to have a long-term care need. So that means either they're disabled under the Equality Act, or they're likely to need care for more than 3 months, or they require care for a reason connected with old age. And an employee that wants to take the leave has to give notice. So they have to give a minimum of 3 days notice to their employer if they want to take a half day or a single day. If they want to take a longer period of leave, then they need to give twice as much notice. So if, for instance, you wanted to take 2 days of leave, you would need to give 4 days notice. Now, an employer cannot prevent you from taking, or an employee from taking the leave, but they could postpone the leave for up to 1 month if they reasonably consider that it would cause undue disruption to the business. And the last thing to note from the new legislation is that it provides protection for individuals who are taking carers leave or seeking to exercise their right to take carers leave. So they're protected from detriment or dismissal for exercising the right to take the leave.
Okay, thank you. So can you just explain how that sort of sits along other rights like parental leave or time off for dependents? You sort of covered that, but how does it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a number of other rights that are available to carers, and I suppose what right will be applicable will really depend on the circumstance. So as I explained, kind of carers leave is intended for leave that is planned. It's foreseen because you've got to give notice. So it could be, as I said, medical appointments, or perhaps you're helping someone move into a care home and you know about it and you give notice. But there's also a type of leave which is for emergency situations, and that's time off for dependents, reasonable time off for dependents. That's also an unpaid type of leave, like carers leave, but it's where you don't have to give any notice. It really is intended for those kind of unforeseen circumstances, and it's only a right to take a very kind of limited amount of time off. It's just to deal with the emergency situation and put in place long-term care arrangements. A carer could also potentially utilise unpaid parental leave. So if the dependent is a child under the age of 18, some employees have the right to take parental leave. Again, this is an unpaid form of leave, just like carers leave and time off for dependents. The difference here is that employees have to have 1 year's service to take this type of leave. So it's not a day one right. You've got to have built up a length of service with your employer, and you have to give quite a lot of notice. You have to give 21 days notice to take the leave. So again, this is more for kind of planned situations, and it's not quite as flexible as carers leave. You've got to take the leave in blocks of 1 week, and you can take up to a maximum of 4 weeks in 1 year. And lastly, of course, the key kind of right, the right to request flexible working, which could be very useful for carers. That's, again, a day one right. All employees can utilise that. And although typically flexible working is seen as a right to request permanent changes to terms and conditions, it could be utilised potentially to request a kind of temporary change. So perhaps you've got an acute period of care need where you need to support a dependent. You could make a request for a temporary change. The key thing to kind of note for that is you can only make 2 requests in 1 year. So if you are making a temporary change, you just request a temporary change. You just want to think about the maximum number of requests you can make in a year, 2. So there's different types of leave that you can take depending on the type of situation that you're in.
Thank you. That's helpful, Louise. I mean, 1 week sounds very short, and not that helpful. Sue, why do you think the government limited it to just 1 week, and not just 1 week, but unpaid? And what do you see as the practical limitations of that? It just feels very punitive and very, unfair.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose governments are always carrying out a balancing act between the needs of businesses and other organisations that employ people, on the one hand, to keep their business running, and the needs of the individuals, in this case carers, on the other. So it is a balancing act. I'm not sure they've struck the balance in quite the right place. But what they do tend to do is introduce these rights quite modestly to sort of test the water, see what the take-up is. As you've said, it's unpaid, but some employers are enhancing that. I guess that down the line, there'll be further consultation and the government will get a sense of whether this is being taken up, whether it is, because if lots of employers end up paying people for carers leave, then it's going to become much more acceptable for them to legislate for all employers to do that, or maybe all bigger employers or something like that. So I think it's a kind of softly. And as Louise has said, a lot of these sort of, we might call them slightly on the fringe types of leave, like the time off for family and dependence and parental leave as well, they're unpaid. So it's kind of in that context of ones that might cause more of a furore if employers were ordered to pay them straight off when they're introduced. But those have remained unpaid and they've been on the books for a while. But I think I'm right in saying that paternity leave originally was unpaid, and that's now paid. So it's sometimes the sort of the route in.
Starts and it may change. So Louise just talks about flexible working requests and sort of the relationship with carers leave. How does it interact in practice? What does that look like with flexible working requests?
Well, as Louise has implied, I think still flexible working requests are going to be the most valuable thing for carers in most situations, not least because, as Louise said, they can be temporary. They don't have to be permanent. And obviously, if you've only got the statutory right to 1 week's unpaid leave in your workplace, that may very well not be enough for perhaps caring for an elderly relative who's had an operation and needs to be looked after at home afterwards. But you may be able to work from home while you're looking after them for more than a week. So then flexible working, a temporary flexible working request potentially could be your answer. So it's I think different types of leave have different purposes, and but where you do need absolute time off and you can't work at all, even from home or shorter hours or whatever it may be as a flexible working request, if you need some time completely off and it's a planned thing, then
that's not,
then
that's not flexible
you
working.
need to get the carers leave then.
Yeah. Also, just on that flexible working piece, obviously, when you put request in, people would ask, should we be upfront about the reasons for taking flexible working and wanting to make a change? I don't know if there's any thought that you could, give around. Is it okay to say that it's pertaining to care responsibilities, or is it better not to say? And I suppose that ties into my next question, Louise, which is, what are the legal risks if they the employers mishandle requests? What does that sort of look like?
Yeah. Well, I think on your first part, I think it is important to explain the reasons why you want the leave, because that does need to be considered carefully by the employer. So I think that is important to set out the reasons why. In terms of, I suppose, delving into the kind of the protections that are available for carers, in terms of actually kind of requesting the carers leave, there is this protection from detriment or dismissal. So, an employer shouldn't be treating someone detrimentally, perhaps not putting them forward for promotion or dismissing them because they've made that request. And a key thing to kind of note there is that in terms of being able to bring a claim for unfair dismissal, you don't have to have the 2 years service, which you would normally need to have to bring an unfair dismissal claim. So that's a kind of day one right. The other thing is that a carer could bring a claim for the employer refusing their request or unreasonably postponing it, and the tribunal can award what compensation is just and equitable. I mean, as far as I'm aware, we haven't had any cases yet on requesting carers leave, so we don't know what that would look like, the kind of the levels of compensation that a tribunal may award. But there is also that right that carers have. And then there's kind of this kind of wider protection for carers, just aside from actually requesting carers leave, that there is protection from discrimination or harassment if you're associated with someone who is protected under the Equality Act, perhaps because of, for instance, because of their age or disability. So if I take an example around that, so say someone applies for promotion, it requires a lot of travel. they care for their disabled son. Even though they've got the best skills and experience for that role, if an employer decides, actually, we're not going to give them that promotion because we don't think they can do the role because of their caring responsibilities, that would amount to direct discrimination because of their association with a disabled person, and that would be against the law. So there's this kind of broader protection for carers. So yes, there is a number of protections, which is why really, if employers are receiving requests from carers or they're implementing policies, they need to carefully think about the impact on carers and really take on board their views, consult with them, and think about, how can they be proportionate? How can they kind of weigh up the interests of the carers against the kind of the interests of the business, but being very careful about how they handle requests.
Has there been any case law that you could share that is interesting? I know that there was one, the nationwide one. What was that?
Yeah, so that's a really kind of headline grabbing case that follows a nationwide case. So that was a case a few years ago. It was so Mrs. Follows, she was a senior lending manager at Nationwide, and she worked from home to look after her elderly and disabled mother. Nationwide decided it wanted all of its senior lending managers back into the office full time, which she refused. And she lost her job. And she was successful in bringing a discrimination by association claim. It was an indirect discrimination claim. So the tribunal found that this policy of requiring all employees to work from the office full time discriminated against her because of her association with her disabled mother. So she was successful in her claim. She won 350,000, so really significant sum of money.
Really significant.
Yeah, and this case, I mean, it's been termed as a kind of family or friend case, that you're kind of protected because of your association with someone who is protected under the Equality Act. So, for instance, they're disabled. But some changes to the law came in last year to legislation around the kind of tests for indirect associative discrimination, which means now that an employee would need to show, if they're bringing that type of claim, that they are disadvantaged by the policy in substantially the same way as the protected group. So it may be that in cases in the future, similar facts to the kind of the case in Follows, that would be harder to succeed. But there is still protection for carers if they can show that they are substantially disadvantaged in the same way as the protected group. So it's all a bit technical, but yes, there is still, employers do need to be very cautious, and there are risk areas for employers. So they need to handle kind of the requests, and they're thinking through their policies. If they, for instance, they've got a policy of having everyone to return to the office, that they may well need to make exceptions for carers. They've got to think about those individual circumstances for carers.
Absolutely. And just talking about the employer's role in all of this, we talked about how tight the policy is, for want of a better description, in terms of being a week and being unpaid. But like maternity and like other policies that don't necessarily give any enhancements, there are examples of employers who were more progressive employers who go beyond the statutory minimum and do offer greater, more enhancements around this. And I just thought, for anyone watching who is an employer or a business, what are some of these things that a more progressive employer could do to support their people better outside of the 1 week policy and maybe even the flexible working? Like, Sue, what are we seeing, and what can employers think about?
Yeah, well, Winkworth Sherwood, quick plug for us. We offer 2 weeks paid, so twice as long unpaid leave for carers. So, and that's kind of there are variations in terms of paid. carers leave, we have found an example of Centrica doing something similar, 10 days, which is presumably the 10 working days. So that's the same as 2 weeks. And they, in fact, offer a further 10 days if it's matched with annual leave. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but presumably 1 week of annual leave for 1 week of extra paid carers leave. University of Oxford gives you longer but doesn't pay you. So they'll offer up to 4 weeks of carers leave, but all unpaid. Virgin Media, 1 week paid. So they're just paying you for the basic amount. That's the sort of range that we're seeing. So somewhere around the sort of 1 to 2 weeks paid really would be, or maybe longer unpaid.
So what I'm seeing is that these limited offerings and this limited statutory policy is actually pushing people out of the workplace, as you've said in your stats earlier, whether it's 1 week or two. If you've got caring responsibility and there's no one else taking care and you need to be offering that to your dependent, whether that's your husband, your child, or whoever, generally it means that because they're so limited, you're actually being forced out of the workplace, which is what we're seeing. But for organisations with fewer resources who can't necessarily afford 2 weeks or paid, or are there any sort of more simple steps that they could take to better support carers?
I think it's really about awareness, which sounds a simple point, but I think that's kind of broken down into two parts. I think it's employers actually having an understanding of their obligations towards carers and actually making sure their managers are aware. And the reason I raise that is because Carers UK did some research last year, 6 months on from the Act coming in, so the new carers leave coming in. And it found that 3/4 of employers hadn't raised awareness or trained their managers. So I think there's a gap in terms of awareness, both for employers, but also for employees who are carers. I mean, I suppose that's what's really kind of concerning as well, that the research found that 34% of carers who are employees weren't even aware of the new right 6 months on. So I think there is a big piece. It's got a simple step really of just employers, I suppose, getting up to speed and knowing what their obligations are, but also making their managers and employees aware of the right.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is a general issue with employers where you don't make it, you're not transparent enough about these policies. I mean, we see that with maternity policies and parental leaves and all these types of policies. Like, it's not until a manager has to deal with it that they suddenly have to go and ask HR and start digging around and doing their research. They're just not set up for it. And in the same way that when you become a parent or you know bereaved or any of these things that you need your employer to support you with, you sort of find out as you go. So I think there's a huge awareness piece, whether that's carers or other. But also I feel like, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's a real mistake on the part of employers to think, oh, we've got to hide the fact that people could have carers leave because it might cost us money. Because actually all the research shows that by having these sorts of flexible working policies, by showing people that they are valued when they have some other need in their life, that's the way you retain people. And yeah, I mean, one of the stats we found is a study by Global Workplace Analytics, which found that businesses with flexible working arrangements in the broadest sense I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but have a 25% reduction in workforce turnover. So makes economic sense for them.
Yeah,
absolutely. I also feel like there's some possible stigma around requesting carers leave or flexible working, which we need to overcome. You don't want to appear to be vulnerable. You don't want your employer necessarily to know that you have this need and whether that will impact your potential for promotion or to be seen as consistent. It'd just be interesting to get your take, Sue, on kind of those fears and stigmas and whether you see that
Yeah.
as playing a part.
I'm sure that's a very real thing. Just as research has shown that men don't like taking up paternity leave because they're worried it'll affect career progression or they'll be seen as shirking. So with this relatively new idea of carers leave, people will be nervous of it, unless the workplace culture is such that they really do feel supported in taking it. And that obviously starts with the awareness piece. Then people aren't going to want to do it. I mean, I had a sick and dying mother about 10 plus years ago, and it never occurred to me to ask for time off to spend time with her in her last weeks and months. Well, sorry, it occurred to me, but I thought I just can't. That's not a thing, and I was a single mum and I was the breadwinner. So that was that. And I sadly regret that. It would have been great to have had a couple of weeks off with her.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And that's why this awareness is so important, isn't it? Because if they'd been transparent with you and you'd know that that was something that was possible, you would have taken it, and that's had such an impact on you and something that was so important to you at that time. So I think that's there's a definite piece there around awareness, which sounds really simple, but just isn't being done in practice, making an enormous difference to people's lives. So what does a truly sort of carer-friendly workplace culture, let's talk about culture maybe, Louise, what if you're going to try and build a carer-friendly workplace culture, what would could that look like in practice?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different parts to that. Obviously, we've already touched on the awareness piece. It's also about providing, training to managers, making sure that if they receive a request, they know how to deal with that conversation sensitively and they know what to do. And I think also sharing information with managers so that they really can understand more, kind of step into the shoes of carers, really understand, I suppose, the kind of the juggling that they have to do, how difficult it is to manage. And I think that kind of feeds into kind of the second part, really, which is it's really about compassion. It's about taking a stance of thinking about what is possible, what can be done, rather than approaching it from a kind of negative view of, well, we can't have this for
how
these
can we avoid it into how can we help?
Yeah. It's really thinking about, starting from a mindset of what can be done. I think if you've got the resources to do so, it's paying for carers leave. I mean, as Sue said, the kind of the standard, I suppose, at the moment where employers are enhancing is 1 or 2 weeks. So I think thinking about, can you do that to enable more people to take time off? But also there's the broader picture about flexible working, because the 1 week's carers leave is just a small part of it. It also could be, you need to think about, does the employee need to work from home more, or do they need to adjust their hours or days? And I think that is the bigger picture. It's about having flexible working practices which enables employees to manage their caring responsibilities and keep them in work. That is absolutely fundamental to the whole piece.
So they're intrinsically linked, aren't they? Flexible working and care.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can't have one without the, you've got to think about the broader picture.
But at the minute they're not combined, you just use them, you lever them for different things. So you'd either lever your flexible working because you can't lever your carers.
Yeah, but I think it's about employers looking at that bigger picture of what can they offer in terms of the more wider flexible working practices. And also, I suppose, because carers are in such a kind of, they often feel very isolated and vulnerable. It's thinking about what support and resources you can offer to them. I mean, if it's a bigger employer, then perhaps they could put together a carers network where employees can take support from one another. If you're a smaller employer, there may be other networks that you can point your employees to. I mean, we're a member of Better Bankside, which is a business improvement district, and that set up a carers network. So all employees within the kind of Blackfriars Borough Market type area, they can join that network to have support from each other. So I think it's thinking about what support you can offer resources, you can point employees to, you may offer paid counselling of a certain number of sessions to help with wellbeing, or an employee assistance programme, but just making sure that carers know the different types of support and resources that they have, as well as obviously their legal rights.
Absolutely. And so we've talked a little bit about what reform could look like, and you've talked about maybe it going from 1 week to 2 week and going from unpaid to paid. What other changes would you sort of personally like to see strengthen carer rights beyond those, or is that kind of the main place that you see that improving?
I think it's mostly been said, actually, by Louisa in the course of our discussion. I think another way perhaps of expressing it is for employers to be proactive. So don't just deal with an isolated request and say yes or no, but if somebody comes with a request for a week's carers leave, suggest to them actually, what are your needs? Talk it through. Maybe you do need to move to some kind of flexible working arrangement, rather than, if you like, being a gatekeeper and trying to stop people exercising any of these rights. Be more of an open offerer of support. And that's how it becomes culturally acceptable. Yeah.
Yeah, so the last couple of points I was going to make with you both, we can just open them, because I think we've covered most of it now already. It's sort of employee, I was going to ask you for employees, 1 or 2 things that they should know, but I think we've sort of covered that. And then from an employer perspective, some important steps. But are there any as we wrap, are there any sort of last thoughts that you can give around that maybe we haven't covered, or reiterate that from an employee or from an employer perspective, what could be done differently, or sort of important steps or things just to help this along? And I think we've talked about transparency, awareness, training, knowing your rights. What is there anything else that you could leave us with your thoughts?
I suppose it's a point of detail really on managers themselves, where appropriate, taking carers leave or working flexibly, because we all know that the culture of an organisation filters down from the top, and that behaviour that people see modelled, or practices that people see modelled, they understand to be acceptable in the organisation. So it's a very simple thing, but if managers exercise these rights, then that becomes culturally acceptable in that organisation.
Thank you.
I suppose the other thing to flag is the reform that's coming in with in terms of flexible working through the Employment Rights Bill. So although it's not going as far as the government kind of initially indicated, that it would be flexible working by default, the protections for employees will be strengthened, because at the moment, if an employer wants to reject a request for flexible working, it's hard to challenge that. It's a very subjective test. An employer can just say, I'm relying on one of the 8 statutory grounds as to why we're refusing your request, and that's very, as I said, very difficult to challenge. So the flexible working legislation is going to be changed so that there's this kind of test of reasonableness. Employers will need to show that they've acted reasonably in their decision making. So it all comes back to, I suppose, what some of the points we've raised during this talk. It is really thinking about requests very carefully, and really, I suppose, having the starting from mindset of what can you do to try and accommodate matters, rather than taking a kind of very negative stance from the beginning, and having that kind of consultation with the employee to try and find ways of working. What could be accommodated? Can we have a trial period to see how it works? So it's just a fact that those changes will be coming in with the Employment Rights Bill.
Okay, good. Thank you, Louise. So for the people who are watching live, if you do have any questions for Sue or for Louise that you would like to pop into the chat box, now's your chance. And we can answer anything. It'd be good to know whether you're joining this because you are a carer and you wanted to find out more, or whether you're an employer and you were interested in how to think about enhanced, or how to support your employees better. So it'd be lovely if you could just pop a little note in the chat and let us know. And And if there aren't any other questions or any questions that come through, then I think we'll leave it there. But thank you so much, Sue and Louise, for your insights. I think it's a lot of food for thought. Oh, we have got a question. Sorry, I can't see your actual name. It just says RSH. So sorry about that. But do you have a list of employers that have employment ops for carers? That's probably more for me. No, I don't have a list of them, but there is an organisation called Working Families, and they too tend to put together some really coherent and good lists of different family-friendly employers. And so if you have a look at their website, generally they're pretty helpful, and they have helplines as well. But that is an idea to showcase more family-friendly opportunities for people who do have caring. But I think it's also been really interesting to hear about the flexible working element too, and to think about not just the carer's leave itself, but how you can integrate and lever other policies to support. Thank you, Laura. Okay, so thank you so much, Sue, and to Louise. Obviously, we will be sending this out more broadly. Louise, I know that you've put together a comparison of rights table for carers, which we're going to share with everybody who registered and who attended. So we hope you find that useful. You can reach out to Louise or to Sue via their LinkedIn if you would like to. And I hope that you all found the session really helpful. Thank you both very much, ladies. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.